Richard Whitmore had been standing in the same circle of suited men for nearly 20 minutes, glass of champagne in one hand, his other casually tucked into his pocket. He had just delivered a smooth summary of the company's quarterly projections, earning nods from two investors he'd been chasing for months. To anyone watching, he looked perfectly at ease, confident, unshakable, in control. But when a lull in the conversation came, his gaze drifted toward the far end of the hall, instinctively searching for his daughter. At first, he expected to see her as she had been for most of the evening, sitting quietly at her small table, hands folded in her lap, eyes somewhere far away. It was an image that had become disturbingly familiar over the past 2 years. He told himself that she preferred it that way, that she wasn't much for crowds anymore, that the wheelchair made her self-conscious. And in the busyness of his schedule, it had been easy to accept those reasons. But what he saw now made him pause mid-breath. Clara was still at the same table, but she wasn't alone. A man and a boy sat with her, their plates half empty, their postures relaxed. Clara was leaning slightly toward the boy, her expression open, eyes bright in a way Richard hadn't seen in far too long. Her lips were curved into an unguarded smile, one that deepened into quiet laughter as the boy said something animatedly, his hands moving to illustrate the story. Richard felt a flicker of something, confusion first, then curiosity, and beneath that, an uncomfortable twist in his chest. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard her laugh like that. He glanced back at his investors, their conversation resuming without him, but their words suddenly felt muffled. He excused himself politely, though not without noting their faint surprise, and began making his way across the hall. As he approached, he caught snippets of conversation. "And then Sir Fluffington knocked the whole basket over," the boy was saying, his tone conspiratorial. Clara laughed again, covering her mouth with one hand. Daniel, the man, apparently the boy's father, shook his head with a chuckle. "That cat's going to be the end of us." Richard slowed as he reached the edge of the table, not wanting to interrupt too abruptly. He noticed the plain plates in front of them, the absence of the elaborate desserts from the main table, and the easy, unself-conscious way they all sat together. It was striking, how different this felt from the polished, guarded conversations in the rest of the room. Clara turned at the slight movement, her eyes widening in surprise. "Dad," she said, "this is Daniel and his son, Noah." They were sitting alone too. Richard's gaze shifted to Daniel, who stood politely, offering a firm but unpretentious handshake. "Sir," he said, meeting Richard's eyes evenly. "We just thought no one should have to sit alone on their birthday." For a moment, Richard had no words. That sentence, so simple, cut straight through him. It was true, his daughter had been sitting alone. In a room he had filled with guests, music, and celebration, she had been apart from it all. And until now, he had accepted that without question. He looked at her again, at the faint flush on her cheeks, the spark in her gaze. This was the Clara he remembered from before the accident, vibrant, engaged, alive. And it struck him with painful clarity that someone else, not him, had brought that out tonight. There was a time when Richard prided himself on knowing exactly what his daughter needed. He had built this entire evening around the belief that grandeur could fill the space where laughter used to live. But now, watching her interact so freely with these two strangers, he realized how wrong he had been. Daniel didn't fill the silences with pity or awkward small talk. Noah didn't hesitate before speaking to her. They treated her as though the wheelchair was simply part of the furniture, no more important than the color of her dress. And Clara responded to that in a way she hadn't responded to anything he'd given her in years. The guilt came quietly at first, then stronger. He had been so focused on creating a flawless event that he'd missed the most obvious truth: his daughter didn't need flawless. She needed real. Clearing his throat, Richard stepped closer and pulled out an empty chair. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been all evening. Clara's eyes widened again, but this time with something that looked almost like hope. "Sure, Dad," she said, and her smile, small but genuine, was all the answer he needed. Richard had expected it to feel awkward, sitting down at the small table where his daughter had been happily talking with two strangers. He thought there would be a barrier. A distance between them that had grown over the past 2 years and could not be crossed so easily. But as the minutes passed, that feeling began to dissolve. The conversation picked up without hesitation. Clara, clearly still riding the warm energy of the evening, told them about her failed attempt to bake cookies last winter. "I followed the recipe exactly," she said, gesturing with her fork, "and somehow they still came out like hockey pucks." Noah nearly spit out his water laughing. "You just described every cookie my dad has ever made." Daniel raised a hand in mock protest. "I'll have you know my peanut butter cookies are edible." "Barely," Noah added, and the table erupted in laughter again. Richard listened, not as a host overseeing his guests, but as a father seeing his daughter in a way he hadn't in a long time. There was a liveliness in her tone, a looseness in her shoulders, that told him she felt safe here. It wasn't the safety of being protected. It was the safety of being understood. When the laughter subsided, Richard finally spoke. "So," he said, looking at Daniel, "how did you two end up at this party?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I do some work for one of the catering suppliers. They had extra seats at one of the tables, and, well," he glanced at Noah. "We don't pass up free cake." The honesty of it made Richard smile despite himself. In this room full of calculated conversations and subtle networking, here was someone who admitted they came for cake. Clara leaned forward, her eyes bright. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice simple but sincere. Something in Richard's chest tightened. He had given her this night, this hall, this expensive spectacle, but it was these two strangers who had made her glad. When the music shifted to a slow, winding melody, a few couples moved toward the small dance floor. Around them, guests began gathering their coats, saying polite goodbyes, and leaving behind half-finished glasses of champagne. But at Clara's table, the evening lingered. Daniel checked his watch. "We should probably get going soon," he said to Noah. "Big day tomorrow." Noah pouted slightly. "But we didn't finish talking about Sir Fluffington's escape attempt." "You'll have to save that for next time," Clara said quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, if there's a next time." Daniel smiled. "I think we can make that happen." Richard stood, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than they appeared to. Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. We just didn't want her to be alone." But Richard knew better, this wasn't just about filling a seat. This was about seeing someone his own eyes had overlooked. Clara reached into the small paper bag on her lap and pulled out a folded shape. Crisp, precise lines forming delicate wings. "Here," she said, handing it to Noah. "I made this earlier today. It's a crane." Noah turned it over in his hands, his grin wide. "This is awesome. I read that in Japan," Clara added softly, "if you make 1,000 paper cranes, you get a wish." "Well," Noah said, setting the crane carefully in his pocket, "I hope you make 1,000 and get the best wish ever." They left with easy goodbyes, Noah waving over his shoulder until they disappeared through the grand doors. The hall felt quieter after they were gone, though the quartet was still playing. Richard sat back down beside his daughter, the two of them watching the flicker of her candle on the now half-eaten slice of cake. For the first time all evening, he noticed how small that flame looked compared to the towering cake at the center of the room, and yet how much more it seemed to matter. "You know," he said slowly, "I don't think I've asked you in a while. What do you want for your birthday next year?" Clara tilted her head, a slow smile forming. "Maybe, something smaller. Lemon cake." "And Daniel and Noah." Richard nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Consider it done." 1 year later. The Whitmore Hall looked different, still beautiful, but warmer. Fewer guests. Round tables closed together. A lemon cake sat proudly in the middle of the dessert table, its pale yellow frosting catching the light. Daniel and Noah arrived early, this time by invitation, and the four of them sat together from the start. When it came time to sing, the song was louder, not because there were more voices, but because the voices were full of joy. And Clara blew out the candles surrounded by people who truly saw her. Birthdays, she realized, weren't about the size of the party or the number of gifts. They were about who pulled up a chair and stayed. And this year, she had everything she wished for. The Whitmore Banquet Hall was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city skyline glittering against the dusk. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light over white linen tables, each adorned with silver cutlery and roses imported from Italy. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their elegant music weaving through the gentle hum of conversation. Every detail had been meticulously arranged by Richard Whitmore's event team to mark his only daughter's 12th birthday. At the center of the hall, on a raised dais draped in pastel silk, stood a 12-tier chocolate cake, its glossy ganache catching the light like a jewel. It was flanked by towers of macarons, bowls of sugared almonds, and sparkling punch fountains. Beside it sat an elaborate pile of gift boxes wrapped in shimmering foil, each with crisp, expensive ribbons. And yet, the person for whom all this was meant sat alone at a small table tucked just off to the side. Clara Whitmore, her brown hair falling softly over her pale blue dress, rested her hands neatly on her lap. Her wheelchair was angled slightly toward the cake, though she wasn't really looking at it. Instead, her gaze lingered on the single slice of cake in front of her, one lone candle flickering atop it. She had already been told to wait before blowing it out. Her father wanted the moment captured professionally, with the photographer ready and the guests' attention drawn. But the party had been going for nearly an hour, and no one had come to her table yet. Around her, the room was full of laughter, but none of it was hers. The children of her father's business associates darted between the tables, their giggles echoing under the high ceiling as they chased each other toward the dessert station. Groups of women in shimmering gowns leaned close to talk, their diamond earrings swaying with every nod. Men in tailored suits clinked champagne glasses, exchanging news about stock prices and corporate mergers. Clara was visible, everyone knew she was there, but she wasn't part of anything. Her father, Richard, was across the room, his tall frame unmistakable even in the crowd. He stood in a tight circle with three men, one of whom she recognized from a business magazine cover. His smile was polished, his posture commanding, his hand gestures controlled, the smile and stance he used for investors, not for her. Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Since the accident 2 years ago, parties had become complicated. People didn't seem to know how to interact with her anymore. The children who once played tag with her in the Whitmore garden now glanced uncertainly at her wheelchair, offering quick, polite hellos before running off. Adults spoke to her in slow, careful voices, as if she were fragile glass that might shatter at the wrong word. Her father, though always generous with gifts, seemed busier than ever, his way of showing love now measured in expensive gestures rather than shared moments. She shifted slightly, her hands brushing the smooth armrests of her wheelchair, and forced her gaze down to the candle. The little flame wavered in the air-conditioned breeze, bright and delicate against the polished silver plate. For a fleeting second, she considered blowing it out right then, quietly making a wish before anyone noticed. But the thought of doing it alone, of making a wish in a room full of people who weren't really with her, made her chest ache. The quartet's music swelled, masking the faint sound of her sigh. She sat still, spine straight, lips pressed together, holding herself in the same quiet dignity she had learned since the accident. But inside, the loneliness pricked at her like a cold wind. She wondered, not for the first time, if her father even noticed. Her birthday, it seemed, was just another event for his calendar. Clara was tracing the edge of her plate with one finger, watching the flickering candlelight reflect in the polished silver, when she felt a faint shift in the air behind her. At first, she assumed it was another waiter passing by, most of them barely slowed when they walked past her table. But then, over the muffled hum of music and voices, came a tone she wasn't used to hearing at these events. It wasn't loud, or formal, or filled with polite pity. It was warm. Steady. "Hey," the voice said gently, "is this seat taken?" Clara blinked, startled, and looked up. Standing just beside the table was a man who looked entirely out of place among the silk ties and evening gowns. His blazer was neat but slightly worn at the cuffs, and his shirt was buttoned carefully though the collar was a little rumpled, like he'd straightened it in the car. In his hands he balanced a small plate with 2 plain slices of cake. No gold leaf, no sugar roses, just cake and a modest swirl of icing. Beside him stood a boy about her age, maybe a little younger. His brown hair was slightly messy, and there was a kind of shy brightness in his eyes that made it hard to look away. He held a fork in one hand, tapping it against the edge of his plate in a quiet rhythm, not from impatience but from a sort of gentle energy. Clara hesitated. People didn't usually approach her without being prompted, especially not strangers at her father's business gatherings. And if they did, the conversations felt rehearsed, as if they were ticking off a polite obligation before moving on. But these two didn't have that look. "I'm Daniel," the man continued, as if sensing she might not respond right away. "This is my son, Noah. We don't really know many people here. Thought maybe you wouldn't mind a couple of party crashers." Noah grinned and added quickly, "We brought our own cake." Clara glanced at the plain slices, and for the first time that night, her lips twitched into something close to a smile. "That's different," she murmured. "Different is good," Daniel said with an easy shrug. "Mind if we sit?" She glanced briefly across the room at her father, who was still deep in discussion, his back partly turned toward her. Nobody else seemed to be paying attention. Her table, with its empty seats, was still a quiet island in the noisy sea of celebration. She swallowed, then nodded. "I guess, yeah. Sure." Daniel smiled, not the polished, perfect smile of a man closing a deal, but the kind of smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle, the kind that felt like it belonged to real life. He pulled out a chair for Noah and sat down beside her, setting his plate down as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "We figured," Daniel said, leaning slightly forward, "that birthdays shouldn't be spent alone. Even if it means sharing the cake meant for someone else." The way he said it was casual, but it carried a quiet sincerity that wrapped around her like a blanket. Clara felt something shift inside her, small, but noticeable. It had been a long time since someone had simply chosen to sit with her. Not because they were told to. Not because they felt sorry for her. But because they wanted to. For the first time that night, she didn't feel invisible. The first few minutes at the table passed in quiet comfort. Clara, still cautious, took a small bite of her cake while sneaking glances at Noah. He was scraping the icing neatly to one side of his plate. When he noticed her watching, he grinned. "I like the cake part better than the icing," he confessed. "That's unusual," Clara replied. Noah shrugged. "Guess I'm not most people." That answer made her smile, a real one, not the polite smile she gave to adults at these parties. Daniel leaned forward, his tone easy. "So, with all this fancy food, I've gotta ask, what's your actual favorite kind of cake? I'm betting it's not that massive tower over there." Clara hesitated before saying, "Lemon. But my dad thinks chocolate looks more elegant." She mimicked the word with her fingers. Noah brightened. "Lemon cake is the best. Like, a party in your mouth." Clara laughed, unexpectedly, warmly. The sound seemed to surprise even her. The conversation began to flow. Noah told her about a stray cat they'd rescued the week before. "It's called Sir Fluffington," he said proudly. Daniel chuckled. "It's called Mittens. He just won't respond to it." Clara laughed again, the heaviness inside her lifting just a little. When Daniel asked about school, she found herself answering honestly, how she took some classes online now, how she missed soccer but had started sketching. "What do you draw?" Noah asked, leaning closer. "Horses, mostly," Clara said. Noah grinned. "Sir Fluffington on a horse." She rolled her eyes, but her cheeks were still warm from smiling. The string quartet shifted to a gentle piano tune. Daniel tapped his fork thoughtfully. "You know, this cake needs a proper birthday song. What do you think, Noah?" "Definitely," Noah agreed. Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She'd grown used to avoiding the spotlight. But here, there was no crowd, no judgment, just two people who seemed to genuinely want to celebrate her. She nodded. And so, right there, Daniel and Noah sang "Happy Birthday." It wasn't perfect, Daniel's voice cracked once, and Noah rushed the last line, but it was warm, genuine, and meant just for her. By the end, Clara was smiling so hard her cheeks ached. For the first time in years, her birthday felt like hers.